Learning new words is undoubtedly the foundation of learning any language. Expanding your vocabulary enhances your ability not only to express yourself, but also to understand others. Unfortunately, the way most language learners approach learning vocabulary can actually damage other areas of your language skills, including pronunciation and oral comprehension. In this episode, I'll show you how you can 10x your Spanish vocabulary the right way using audiobooks. Así que vamos a empezar. Let's get started.
Bienvenidos! Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast, the show for Spanish learners that love music, travel, and culture. Close your grammar textbooks, shut down the language apps, and open your ears to how Spanish is spoken in the real world. Let us show you how to go from beginner to bilingual. Here is your host, certified language coach, Tamara Marie.
Hola, bienvenidos al episodio 128. Welcome to episode 128 of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. In this episode, I'm going to break down the exact steps you should follow if you want to 10x your Spanish vocabulary the right way. And the way I suggest to do that, if you're at the intermediate level, is by using audiobooks. Now, in last week's episode, I talked about 3 things you should stop doing at the intermediate level. So if you missed that episode, go back and check out episode 127 from last week, where I give you some hints and some suggestions for some things that may have served you at the beginner level, but may no longer be working for you if you want to get to the next level with your Spanish. And this episode is really a continuation of that. One of the things I mentioned in episode 127 is that you should focus on content that was made for native Spanish speakers and not only content made for Spanish learners. So a great example of that is audiobooks, and I'll get into exactly how you can use audiobooks to improve your vocabulary, but I want to give you some reasons for why this is a good approach and why other approaches might be failing. Now, you can really use these steps with any content that's intended for a native Spanish-speaking audience, whether that is music, like we talk about a lot on this podcast, whether that might be news broadcast, although I would only recommend doing that if you're a news junkie and that's something you really enjoy, or if you're about to prepare for a trip to a certain country. I've mentioned that before on other episodes about travel, that it's a great way to prepare for your trip and also increase your Spanish exposure if you just start following the news broadcast from the place that you're about to visit. So you can do this with other types of content, but I'm going to walk you through how to do it with audiobooks because I think this can be a really effective way to begin to improve your vocabulary for several reasons. First, I want to talk about why other methods fail. Now, many language learners tend to rely on developing reading ability because it's often easier than speaking or trying to really develop your listening skills. Let's face it, a lot of us are really good at reading in Spanish when we first start learning. We start to recognize some of the words. There are a lot of cognates in Spanish and English, so words that are similar in both languages. So usually when we're reading, we can kind of figure out what's going on if we've had some exposure to the language. The problem with that is generally what happens when we follow this approach of just sort of reading without having any audio component. We get to the point where we can understand words when we read them or when we see them, but we're completely lost when the same exact words are uttered by a native Spanish speaker or even sometimes another Spanish learner. And, in my opinion, I've said this before on the podcast that languages that are no longer spoken are considered dead languages. So you don't want to make Spanish a dead language for you, where it's a language that for you only exists as a written language because you don't understand it when you hear it. So my approach to learning vocabulary always involves having that audio component so that you don't get stuck with sort of using your own internal voice for your pronunciation. So for example, When we're reading, a lot of times we sort of read along in our head and we have our like sort of internal voice that we're reading with, if that makes sense. And a lot of times that voice is our own voice, and that voice may not have perfect Spanish pronunciation. That voice doesn't necessarily know how words are linked together in Spanish. So when we're reading sentences, we don't really have a sense of what the true rhythm of that sentence would be if it was to be read aloud. This can be a real detriment to our listening comprehension skills, and it's what leads us to, again, having a vast amount of vocabulary that we ultimately cannot use. In his book, How to Learn a Foreign Language, linguist Paul Pimsleur said, "Speaking and reading are two very different activities, and though reading builds vocabulary, it may actually damage pronunciation." And again, you may have heard me reference Paul Pimsleur before on the podcast. He actually is a linguist. He's passed now, but you may be familiar with the name Pimsleur because he has a program that I've recommended, especially for beginners that want to get started speaking. It's an audio program that solely focuses on sort of listening and repeating and that approach to language learning. So he's very well-respected linguist in the field of language learning. And I think what he said here is key. That even though reading is great for building vocabulary, that it can damage pronunciation. And again, that's due to the link between pronunciation and listening comprehension. So as a non-native Spanish speaker, it's really important that you don't follow this approach where you're only reading as a way to build vocabulary, because that internal Spanish voice that you have is usually riddled with pronunciation errors and unnatural speech patterns. Luckily, audiobooks can actually help us bridge this gap. If you listen to an audiobook while reading along with the print or ebook version, you'll actually improve your vocabulary without getting the pronunciation wrong. And this is super important because when we start to read things and get used to this incorrect pronunciation, even if it's only in our heads, it's very difficult to break that pattern later. So you want to have your first exposure to that word along with the audio so that you know the correct pronunciation from the beginning. You'll be able to tune your ear to hear Spanish and increase your exposure to new words, concepts, and interesting topics. Now, as I mentioned, you can do this with any audio content, especially where you have the transcript, but audiobooks just tend to be great because you already have that written out transcript, so to speak, in the book itself. So you don't have to go searching for a transcript or looking for an audio source that has a transcript. An audiobook is professionally done, usually without very many errors because they've been vetted by publishers, so you know you're getting quality content. Another plus to using audiobooks is not having to necessarily seek out a translation because you can often find